Hello everyone. Today on our Foresee video features, we've got Professor Bryan Adey, and he is the Professor for Infrastructure Management and the head of the Institute for Construction and Infrastructure Management in the Department of Civil, Environmental and Geomatic Engineering at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And for short, they call it ETHZ or ETH Zurich. So he's also an associate member of the Resilient Engineering Group at Nottingham University in England. And he's president of the Code and Research Committee. And we're really happy that he can join us here today. In our description of this video, you can read more about Bryan and his expertise and accolades and how lucky we are to have him on Foresee. So hi, Bryan, how are you? And thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Cheryl.
Yeah, to talk about Foresee. So this is our European research project for a stronger and more resilient multimodal transport infrastructure. So it's European research with the ambition of global solutions. So can you start by telling us a little more about yourself and specifically ETH Zurich's role in the Foresee project?
Sure. So thank you, Cheryl. So a little bit about myself. I'm originally a Canadian, but moved to Switzerland 22 years ago now. I did my doctorate at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne, so in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, on the management of bridges. Upon completion, I moved to Zurich, where I was working in consulting for the management of infrastructure for a 6-year period before I moved to the ETH Zurich to found, I think, the first group in the world that's focused on the management from a technical perspective of infrastructure networks. The ETH, while at the ETH, or my group is focused on everything in a way that can help infrastructure managers make decisions about what they're supposed to do with their infrastructure networks. We do things related to predictions of what might happen in the future, and that has to do with things like risk. We make optimization or optimal work programs. So we take all kinds of information together to say precisely what the best thing would be for infrastructure managers to do. And we take steps to help infrastructure managers improve their processes to make better decisions inside their organizations. Foresee touches on a number of those fields. Obviously on risk assessment and resilience assessment, but because of the different levels we're looking at evaluating risk, it also touches on the last one, implementation, because we talk about simulations, we talk about the use of indicators, and we talk about the measurement of the different values of those indicators. Which would fall into the last bit because it's not from a scientific perspective how you might want to evaluate risk and resilience. It is something that is extremely beneficial to infrastructure management organizations when they want to have a good idea of what the resilience is without taking a long time to do the extensive simulations.
Thank
okay.
You. So yourself and your colleagues recently completed one of the first major deliverables for Foresee, deliverable 1.1, and it's a guideline to measure service provided by and resilience of transport infrastructure. Can you summarize some key insights of this work for our viewers?
Sure. So a deliverable 1.1 was a very interesting product from a very interesting exercise. And as Cheryl, you pointed out, it's called a guideline to measure service provided by and resilience of transport infrastructure. It's interesting in that it involved speaking directly with the leaders of all 6 case studies. that we have in the 4C project to better understand not only the hazards and the infrastructure that they cared about, but also all of the different aspects that they saw relevant or see relevant in the estimation of service and resilience, and then taking into consideration the different capacities of the organizations and people within the research team to come up with these estimates. This has led us to make a guideline that we believe is useful for any people running transportation systems to measure service and resilience. It's, I'd say, structured into three parts, where the first part is focused on how you would set up simulations if you want to run simulations to measure service and resilience. Secondly, it's then set up to use weighted indicators. So if you didn't want to run simulations, and it's very hard to get the whole all of the important aspects into one simulation platform, and many people fail on providing an overview of resilience when they try simulations because they end up focusing on only part of the problem and they ignore all kinds of other parts of the problem. And so to get around that, we said, well, you can develop indicators to give you an idea over the whole system of how it's behaving. And preferably you will weight them in terms of, well, if these indicators themselves, for example, the condition of the infrastructure that you're looking at, has a higher or a lower value, what does that mean in terms of a change in resilience? And what does that mean in terms of a change in loss of service if a failure happens? And this, although perhaps not perfect, is probably the best way to weight the resilience indicators. Now, inside the resilience indicators, we have an A and a B, where we have an A category, which we say that you should have a differentially weighted indicators. So you should think through the effect of the values of each one of the indicators on the resilience and service. But that also is coupled with a fair bit of effort. So we said it's also possible to use just equal weights to kind of think through, well, what is the worst case scenario that we would have and what would be the best case scenario that we would have? And those would be our three ways of measuring resilience and service, or giving an indication of it. And then I don't know if you would like to call it a fourth thing, but many people are then perhaps not even interested in connecting the values of the indicators to service, but would just be interested perhaps in the level of fulfillment of the indicators. Now, obviously, that's only in a very vague way an indication of resilience or a measure of resilience, but I suppose in some ways it is an indication. The higher the values of the indicators, the more resilient you will be, and the lower the values, the less resilient you will be. So that's basically it. It's also interesting because of the many, many discussions, and I should add, we also, on top of that, when we had it almost finished, had a very successful stakeholder reference group webinar, which we got, we had the chance to exchange our thoughts with, Cheryl, you probably know this better than me, but I think something like 15 different organizations. Mm-hmm. And we received many positive comments and some constructive feedback, which led us to have a very robust deliverable in the end.
Absolutely. I think that methodology really enriched the work that was already going on, and this is a Horizon 2020, European Commission funded project, and it was really great to see that engagement with key stakeholders and directly finding its way into your research. Yeah, we're very happy with this deliverable, and thank you for summarizing the key insights. A very general question, but
sure.
In your expert opinion, when we talk about resilient cities and resilient infrastructure, and we think of places like busy cities like Mumbai or, compared to London, what does resilient transport infrastructure sound like? What does it if there's lots of pollution, what does it smell like? But you know, what would resilient transport infrastructure look like to you?
Okay. So I think it's good you started out with the idea of a city like Mumbai. I think one of the keys in measuring the resilience of anything is defining the system boundaries and figure out exactly what it is you're measuring. And so if you're looking at a functioning of a whole city, you are looking at how it's functioning, but you're looking at the whole city, and many other aspects are involved than if you're looking at transportation infrastructure. But if you're looking at transportation infrastructure, you're still looking at how it's functioning. Now, I'll expand a bit on the thought of resilient transport infrastructure, and this coincides with what we wrote in Deliverable 1.1. And I think many people might not use it systematically. So basically, and this is not a surprise to anyone, but it has to do with if a hazard event occurs, how much or how little will the ability to transport things across the infrastructure be affected. I don't know if you can, unless you just say something specific ahead of time, I'm not sure if you can really say something is resilient or not resilient. I think it's more of a relative term where you can have things that are more resilient or things that are less resilient. Mm-hmm. Now, there are a couple of aspects involved in that. It's not just the physical infrastructure itself that plays a role, but many people think that. Obviously, if you have a strong bridge and then you have a big flood and the bridge is still there after the flood, people would call it a resilient bridge. And that is part of it, which is it's the ability of the infrastructure to resist hazards. But there's a big aspect of if it is hurt or damaged in some way due to a hazard, how fast can we fix it? Obviously, if a bridge was damaged, but we could put in a replacement bridge in one day, then somehow the transport system is resilient, although the piece of infrastructure itself might have fallen down. That means, in essence, that there are three things that are very important in resilient transport systems, depending on how you define them. The first is the physical infrastructure itself. And there you're talking mainly about resistance, but then certain characteristics of it would then affect how fast somebody could restore it. The second aspect, though, is really the organization itself. How is it set up? Does it have enough funding? Does it have emergency plans in place? Are there enough construction crews that would be available to take action? And if you go back to the first one, is the infrastructure embedded in a network that would allow deviation of traffic so that people can still transport the goods they need without very much loss of travel time? So we have the infrastructure, we have the organization, but then obviously we can't forget where the transport system is or what environment it's embedded in. Obviously, if you have two bridges that are identical, and one of them is in a hazard, an area where there's a high likelihood of large earthquakes, and you have another one that is in an area where it isn't, well, the transport system in the area that is not likely to have earthquakes of large magnitudes would be considered to be more resilient because it's less likely to fall down, and there's less likelihood of the transport of goods and people to be affected. And so those three things are important. And if I map that back to Deliverable 1.1, we developed these three categories. And then in discussions with the case study leaders came up with at least start indicators that we would use in all three areas to measure the service and resilience. Yeah. So that is what I guess. So resilient, to come back maybe right to the beginning of your question, what does a resilient transport infrastructure looks like? Mm-hmm. It is infrastructure that is designed to resist the hazards that are likely to occur, taking into consideration the environment that it's in, being run by an organization that is well funded and prepared to deal with extreme events that lead to the infrastructure being damaged.
Thank you. Excellent.
Okay.
Yes. So if we look at our project, Foresee, how might Foresee contribute to more resilient transport infrastructure?
So I'm not sure if everyone in Foresee will agree or not. So I'll give you my personal opinion.
Okay.
So I think there's been a lot of European research projects that are dealing with risks related to natural hazards for transport infrastructure. I've been involved in a few myself. Many of these projects lead to a lot of wonderful tools used in lots of wonderful ways. I think, though, or I suspect that they're failing on implementation. I don't imagine that many transport organizations are actually taking the platforms that are being developed by many of the EU projects and using them. Now, part of that, I think, is because there's a lot of very smart people working in these projects, and they're tackling very specific problems. And obviously, when you get into a very specific problem, you develop very specific tools that are not generally applicable or easily applicable in many other ways. And there's no one inside the transport or the organizations running the transport infrastructure that are easily equipped to pick up and use these tools. One of the ways that I see Foresee making a solid contribution, and I'm a bit biased, I suppose, because we just finished deliverable 1.1, is we're actually proposing a guideline that could be used by all transport organizations to get an idea of the resilience of their infrastructure. And it can be used by anyone. And because the case studies now are going forward further with different aspects of it, we not only will have a guideline, we will also have an array of possibilities or examples that will show how the guideline can be used from relatively qualitative, subjective opinions, I guess, to give you an idea of resilience, down to very advanced simulations using satellite imaging of soil movements on the other end. And I'm hoping that we will then in Foresee provide this guideline that can be used by everyone, and not just the people running the transport organizations, but also, I suppose, politicians that wanted to get a systematic overview of where they might want to allocate money if they have multiple organizations that are running the transport infrastructure. And then nice examples that when people are interested in it, they could see how we apply them, or how they can apply them. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for summarising the tangible outputs of Foresee at this point in the project. So thank you very much, Bryan, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in. If you do have any questions at all about some topics that came up today in today's interview, you can contact our coordinator at Technalia, Iñaki Beltran at technalia.com. And please do check out our Foresee website, which is www.foreseeproject.eu. And as always, we thank our funders, the European Commission, for funding this project. And we look forward to relating further results and outcomes of the project as we go. Thank you very much.